Men seem to have no interest in having a partner who's taller than them, and the women seem to have this incredibly exuberant reaction to the question, yes, to lust. Well, practically speaking, I don't really know why women want a taller partner and men don't. Yet, the overwhelming majority of people believe that husbands in heterosexual marriages should be taller than wives. They find it odd when the husband is shorter. And I know you do as well. You look twice, you look 3 times, you're wondering what's going on. Even if the husband and wife are the same height, sometimes you get a raised eyebrow. Now, this attitude is fairly widespread because in our society and in many others, height is an indicator of status, power, and maturity. And most people believe that the man of the relationship should enjoy higher status than his female partner. Now, here's a photographic example to make it clear. On the left, you have the tallest man in the world and his partner. And on the right, you have the tallest woman in the world and her partner. Now, probably both of these images may strike you as odd, given the sheer height of the taller partner. But I'm willing to bet my sociological career that you find the image on the left less unsettling than the image on the right. You may even be rehearsing X-rated stories in your mind right now about how this all works out. Now the thing is, these attitudes are not just about aesthetics within a relationship. I mean, we can laugh about it now and say, you know, it's just about a kind of aesthetic preference between men and women. But really, you can extend this so-called aesthetic preference to a lot of other things, like the leaders of your sports teams, or those that head up a college tutorial who are seen as knowledgeable and formidable versus those who are not. There are a lot of social groups to which you belong where height becomes the standard of how much respect that you give them and how much authority you attribute to them. Perhaps it's not surprising that what's true for height is also true for body weight. Body weight influences status in the same way that height does. We have this cultural expectation that we associate with body weight. So one study of more than 10,000 young men and women like yourself found that overweight women tend to complete 4 fewer months of school than women who are not overweight. Overweight women are also 20% less likely to be married. And if height matters for a man's income, consider this. An overweight woman's household income is on average nearly $10,000 less per year than the household of a woman who is not overweight. I'm going to say that again. An overweight woman's household income is on average nearly $10,000 less per year than the household of a woman who is not overweight. And overweight women are 10% more likely to live in poverty. Now, being overweight matters for men, but less so. Overweight men are 11% less likely to be married than men who are not overweight, as an example. So now the question becomes for us, well, are class and body weight related? We just went through a discussion about how class and height are related, and then all of the effects of height. What about class and body weight? Well, it's certainly true that poor women have fewer opportunities to eat healthy diets, which tend to be more expensive, and they have fewer opportunities to get as much exercise and bring down their weight. However, the reverse is also true. Obesity in and of itself tends to make women poorer over time. So in other words, there's like a reciprocal relationship between obesity and social class. If you're obese, you're more likely to be a poorer class. If you're obese and you're not in a poorer class, you're more likely to become part of a poorer class. Now, of course, this is interesting because in pre-industrial societies, in fact, this was the opposite. The society generally favored well-rounded physiques because they signified wealth and prestige. I have enough food to eat with how large my body is, right? That's what it showed. So these seemingly aesthetic preferences have real effects. They change over time, the preferences themselves, but they have real effects on things like class and marriageability. Now, for some reason in our society, and there can be many sociological reasons for it, being well-rounded and full-figured usually signifies undesirability. And there's a lot of negative attributions that are made to people that are overweight. I will say there's a very interesting book that just came out for those that are interested in this topic. I think it's called What's the Matter with Fat? And it's a book by a sociologist who puts together a lot of research and makes a really fascinating argument, which I'll quickly summarize and you can take it off later if you want. And that is that she believes that we're experiencing in the last 20 or 30 years a moral panic around body weight, wherein anyone who's even slightly overweight is seen to be not only unhealthy, but in some ways immoral. And when she looks at the scientific evidence, she finds something very, very interesting, which is, despite the fact that you're always hearing about these studies which say that overweight people have more disease, they have more health problems, they live less long, et cetera, she finds that if you really look objectively at the literature, while some studies do suggest that being overweight can have bad health effects, other studies show that being somewhat overweight can have actually positive health effects. Now, I've never seen any studies like this, or I haven't been looking for them, until very recently I saw a study that came out about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. It made the news cycle. And what it showed was that people who were slightly overweight actually lived longer than people who were perfectly normal. But anyway, the point is this, and it fits perfectly within a medical sociological framework, which is that the construction of what is healthy and what is not is itself a social formulation. It changes over time. It's culturally dependent. So all of this notion about overweight being so terrible for your health and detrimental to your health requires further examination. And we have to wonder how much of that is actually just sort of a cultural construction in which we attribute being overweight to other bad characteristics, like being lazy or what have you. So something to think about. In terms of obesity, here's some slides with the percentage of adults who are overweight across countries. Obesity affects about 23% of Canadian women, about 24% of Canadian men, compared to nearly 42% of American women, 30% of American men. Here's some Canadian data on obesity. As you can see here, so it looks like the heaviest folks are located in the north and the east. Okay, let's summarize. Height, weight, and social status. On average, high family income results in good diet. Good diet increases stature. Tall people live longer, earn more, reach the top of the professions more quickly than short people. Overweight women complete fewer months of formal education, earn less, and are less likely to marry than women who are not overweight. Okay, finally, the last part of the lecture, I want to talk about the question of disability. Here are some terms to think about. Disability studies, we have two terms, impaired and disabled. So impaired, deficient from physical or mental capacity compared to the norms of society. Disabled, incapable of performing within the range of normal, quote, normal human activity. Okay. Today, about 1/10 of the world's population identifies as disabled or is characterized as such by other people. So being disabled comes with a whole set of disadvantages, not just sort of physical disadvantages that come with being disabled, but also status differences. These disadvantages are compounded by things like being very old, being female, being of a lower class, being racialized. As we talked about in other classes, as we just talked about now with height and weight, people tend to make dispositional attributions to others if they're disabled. Negative dispositional attributions. That is, we attribute a negative personality characteristic to people based on things other than their personality. So in this case, if you see someone that's disabled, we tend to make this kind of negative attribution about their personalities. There's a term, ableism. So ableism is a concept that tries to capture this prejudice and discrimination that comes with being disabled. So you've heard of heterosexism, you've heard of racism. So ableism is the counterpart for those who are disabled. Now, an historical example of ableism. In the 19th century, there was a widespread belief among Western educators that blind people were incapable of high-level thought. So due to this prejudice, people that were blind were systematically discouraged from going to school or pursuing intellectually challenging occupations. Now, ableism involves a lot more than just active prejudice and discrimination, though that, of course, it does. It also involves this largely unintended neglect of the condition of disabled people. And this point should be clear to anyone who has to get around in a wheelchair. Many buildings are constructed in such a way, maybe without the intention of discriminating, but nevertheless, in creating a physical environment that's inhospitable to those who are in a wheelchair. So impairment becomes disability when the human environment itself is constructed in such a way that it doesn't allow for someone with a disability to maneuver. Okay, what about this idea that is disability something that is essential? Is it something that is within the person? Or is it something that is a function of an attribution process? Is it socially constructed? Well, a lot of people in sociology think that disability, like deviance, is socially constructed, which is to say that definitions of what constitutes disability vary over time and place, so that what some people think of as a disability today, others might consider perfectly normal. The classic example of this is left-handedness. You may not know this, but left-handed people were considered inferior, disabled, or evil for many centuries. About 400 years ago, the church declared that left-handed people were servants of the devil. Sometimes left-handed people were burned at the stake because of it. There were policies in the 20th century in American and Canadian schools that forced left-handed students to write using their right hand. In Japan, from what I understand, as recently as the early 20th century, left-handedness in a wife was grounds for divorce. I'm not making stuff up. So almost universally, for some reason, people have considered left-handedness a handicap. So much so that the sentiment has been embedded in many languages. In Russian, to do something nalevo means to do it under the table or illegally, but literally it means on the left. In English, the word left derives from Old English, a word that means weak or worthlessness. Also, in English, gauche means ill-mannered, but the French word from which it's derived means left. Okay, so the idea here is that what we consider a disability is socially constructed. It varies across time and place. It is not something that's absolutely essential across societies. Here's another example that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Now I know this is going to shock you, because most of you have been around as long as Viagra has been around, I think. Viagra is for erectile dysfunction. I know this will shock you, but you know what? Like 25, 30 years ago, a 75-year-old man who did not have an easy erection was not considered a problem. That was considered normal, right? But today, an older gentleman who cannot have an easy, stiff erection is seen as a dysfunction. Notice the word dysfunction, and now requires medical treatment with old Viagra. So these examples suggest how the definition of disability can differ, not just across societies and historical periods, but within a given time, or within a given generation. Societal responses to disability. We have rehabilitation and elimination. So rehabilitation involves curing disabilities through medical and technological intervention, trying to improve their lives by means of care, training, education, and integrating the disabled into normal society. Conversely, elimination involves killing the disabled, burning them at the stake, forcing them to be right-handed, sterilizing them, preventing them from having offspring. This latter approach was taken in Nazi Germany in 1933. There was a sterilization program that killed off anyone who was seen to be mentally deficient and physically deviant, including the blind and the deaf, as an example. Okay, now the most recent trend in societal responses to disability is toward normalization. Normalization, so making normal, rather than seeing something as abnormal or disabled. So in this kind of context, a disability is not considered to be deviant, but it's just a different way of being in the world, and we have this term differently abled that has come about to try to emphasize the ways in which having what previously was a disability may just be another way of maneuvering in the physical world. We don't need to label it with such a negative connotation. I'm going to leave off with a really interesting example, which you may have heard of, and that is the example of deafness. So there is a significant contingent in the deaf community who do not see being deaf as a disability. They are instead differently able. For many in the deaf community, they have their own language, they're able to participate fully in society, they may develop other senses more acutely, and many reject the idea that deafness itself requires any kind of medical treatment. So there are those, as an example, who reject a cochlear implant, which is an implant that can sometimes help previously deaf people hear. So these people reject that because they don't see lack of hearing as a problem. And they emphasize this idea that what we consider to be disability is highly culturally variable. And I'll leave it there.